I've had Loop Hero in my Steam library for quite a while, sitting at zero point 0.6 hours. I basically just got past the tutorial and never got back to it. I've been wanting to clear up my backlog, so I decided to write essays to give me some extra motivation. Unfortunately, after booting up Loop Hero and playing it again, I realized why I never got much farther than the tutorial. The game has a lot of interesting ideas, mechanics, and surprises in it that, unfortunately, are stuck between fairly monotonous gameplay. If this is your first time hearing about it, Loop Hero is a roguelike game with idle game mechanics. Just hearing that description might put some people off, but I promise this isn't a soulless game meant to siphon money from you or waste your time. Or at least maliciously waste your time. You don't control your character's actions at all. He moves and attacks automatically, and the focus of the game is more on making your hero stronger with gear, traits, and long-term progression mechanics. Before I go further, I do want to say that the unlocks and new discoveries you make do change up the gameplay in interesting ways, so if you really enjoy exploring systems and discovering interactions, or you don't mind the gameplay being dull at times, definitely give this game a shot. If you want to hear more about the specifics of the progression and how the gameplay got stale for me, this is your spoiler warning. Let's dive deeper into what I consider to be the biggest problem with the game, the gameplay. There are three main things you do as the player. 1. Place terrain on the map the hero is in to give him bonuses and spawn different enemies to fight. 2. Equip gear to give your hero better stats. And 3. Manage the camp between runs for long-term progress. The idea of designing the maps that your hero runs around in and determining what monsters they fight is a neat premise, especially since the map tiles can interact with each other in a variety of ways that aren't revealed right away. The first one most players will experience is grouping a bunch of mountains and rocks together for efficient HP increases to make the Great Mountain, which gives even more HP. There are a lot of these interactions to discover, and every single tile has at least one interesting interaction with another tile. One thing I came to appreciate about this game is that if you die, it's literally your own fault. The only thing the game will throw at you by default is some basic slimes, which don't give you much gear. So to make your character stronger, you can put down some general terrain tiles that give your character stats, or some tiles that spawn monsters on the loop to drop more gear. Generally, gear ends up being much more impactful in a run, so you'll want to fight as many monsters as you can while staying alive. There's this balancing act of risk and reward. The more enemies you fight, the more gear you get, but also the more likely you are to die and lose the run. You also might end up placing tiles in a certain way that creates a new type of tile, with stronger enemies but even better rewards. Before each run, you choose which tiles to bring with you, starting with only the few basic ones and unlocking more as you progress. Some are rarer than others, and the most common being your spammable terrain tiles that go outside the loop, like mountains, meadows, forests, and dunes. And then the more general monster spawners, etc., until you get to the rarest stuff, like Oblivion tiles, which can remove any other tile in the game. On top of placing normal enemy spawning tiles like cemeteries, groves, and mansions, enemies will also spawn from structures created by placing a certain number of generic land tiles. For example, 10 mountains and rocks will create a goblin camp. This reinforces the idea of having to balance getting power and not spawning too many enemies, this time in a more indirect way since you do get to place some of those tiles down with no consequences, but too many and you might end up overrun. All this is really solid. The main challenge of the game is balancing the difficulty of the enemies you encounter with the gear and bonuses you get from terrain. The problem is that while you can mess around and try out new tiles and combinations, you can be severely punished for it, fighting really annoying monsters or ending up with groups of monsters out of nowhere. So the optimal thing to do is to stick to tiles that spawn enemies you're familiar with and won't overwhelm yourself with. And you don't want to run any extraneous cards for fun, because those are all added to your deck and will make the tiles that you need harder to find. The same goes for the spammable terrain tiles as well. There are 3 classes the hero can have, and each one wants somewhat different tiles for their runs, but they generally will always want to have forests to boost attack speed, rivers to multiply bonuses from the forests, and suburbs to get more XP for killing monsters. These are the most common tiles you'll receive and place, and so a lot of the game ends up being just placing these 3 types of tiles in the most optimal way possible. So when you're punished for trying different enemy spawners and the generic terrain tiles you bring are the same every run, you'll end up with basically the same deck each run, just with slight tweaks depending on your class. Okay, so tile placing is kind of a bust once you figure out the optimal combos. What about gear, the other main aspect of the game you're engaging with for most of your playtime? In my experience, there are generally a few key stats in each class that you want to focus on, and what those stats are depend on what class you pick. You start out with the warrior class, the generic tanky one. He has the most HP, can get quite a lot of defense, and has vampirism and HP regen to replenish that massive HP total to outlast and outdamage the enemies you face. The first class you unlock is rogue, which is basically the opposite of warrior. You have a whole lot of ways to increase your damage, like crit chance and crit damage, but generally what you want is attack speed and evasion to kill enemies before they can touch you. Rogue is also one of the best classes for grinding resources thanks to their trophy bag system. Lastly is the Necromancer. I love a good Necromancer in games, so I was very excited when I got this guy. The Necromancer summons skeletons instead of attacking, which can take aggro from the enemies and deal damage for you. Your most important stats all relate to the skeleton summons, increasing the number you can have, how often you get the stronger versions of them, and their overall strength. In theory, I think all these classes are great. Warrior is a low floor, low ceiling kind of character, Rogue was my workhorse for grinding, and Necromancer was the big guns I sent in to kill the bosses. They're all distinct, and there are a lot of little details, like some of the tiles have different effects depending on what class you are, and the hero's portrait and dialogue changes depending on what class he's currently in. Unfortunately, you don't really get to feel these differences in gameplay, since you aren't really playing these classes. The only gameplay difference you really notice is a change in what stats you have to manage, which are determined almost entirely by your gear. And that is one of my biggest gripes with this game. While the hero is going around the loop, you as the player are going to be spending your time looking up here in the top right corner, checking the stats of the gear you just got versus the gear you already have, and seeing if it's worth swapping. This and placing tiles is 90% of the gameplay in Loop Hero. The decisions on what gear to equip can be interesting. The higher rarity gear has more substats than lower rarity, but in exchange it has lower base stats, so you have to decide if you want to stack one stat higher or jack of all trades it. The problem is that once you know what stats are best for each hero, you're just looking for the same stats over and over. In addition to gear, the other main way to customize and make your hero stronger is through traits. After unlocking them not too far into the game, you can get them in runs by killing monsters for XP and then choosing one of 3 random options. Traits in general are a cool idea to make the hero stronger, since instead of just getting some stat points, they modify how your build works and can allow you to specialize a bit. There are 3 kinds of traits. The first is common traits, which every hero gets. You mostly don't want these since they don't help you in fights and aren't specific to the class you're playing. Which brings us to class traits. Each class has a bunch of traits that only they get, and they range from very niche, like the warrior getting a 35% chance to counterattack during and evade, a stat you rarely build for the class, to run-defining traits like the necromancer getting a +1 permanent max skeleton for the rest of the game. The problem is that there are so many class traits that aren't worth getting, combined with the common traits, you often end up having to choose between 3 that are bad. That is a real problem, because this game basically requires you to get certain traits in order to have a chance at beating the endgame without some extreme grinding. Necromancer is the biggest victim of this. He's very strong if he gets going, but he's also very frail, so he wants to get some traits to help mitigate the damage he takes. If you don't get them, then enemies that happen to target him will quickly overwhelm him, and that's the run. This feeds into the repetitive tile placing as well. To get the best odds of seeing your key traits before you die, you'll want to boost your XP gain. The only real way to do this is with suburbs, which increase the XP you get for killing monsters. Once you unlock them, you'll be bringing them to every run from then on. For the last set of traits, I want to present you with how you're likely to encounter them. You've just beaten the first boss, and you're presented with a reward screen, one of 3 new traits, or a cache of resources. Resources take time and effort to acquire, so getting a bunch on top of the already successful run is tempting. The traits are a different form of progression though, and adding a new one could be a fun new build or a way to spice up a run later. So you choose one of the more interesting traits and get into the next run. And early in the next run, you see that trait and realize your mistake. It is not one of the traits you need to survive or get a build going. You've actually made the game harder by unlocking it. For most boss traits, you're better off disabling them before a run. This means you're missing out on one of the key fun aspects of roguelikes, messing around with the cool new things you have unlocked. Now you might be wondering, how does an idle game handle bosses if you can't interact with them directly? Well, Loop Hero handles it in 2 ways, one good and one bad. Bosses spawn at your camp once you've placed enough tiles to fill up this meter, replacing your campfire tile that heals you. So you have to be careful about what tiles you place and how many you place, making sure that you're geared up enough and ready for the fight. Or you can be like me and be half paying attention and then have your stomach drop as the music swaps out after placing a random forest tile. There are 4 bosses in the game, and each one has its own gimmick. The first one, the Lich, has a really interesting gimmick that takes advantage of the core gameplay. When you first fight him, he's pretty likely to wreck you, and it won't even be close. That's because when he spawns, any blank tiles around your campsite are covered in Lich Palace tiles, each of which is boosting his health and damage by 5%, up to 40%. You can reduce this in advance by placing tiles around your campfire, or even using Oblivion tiles to remove them after he spawns. Then you just have to have enough damage and survivability to kill him before he kills you. I think the Lich is a good way to do boss fights. He is a tougher challenge on both of the core gameplay aspects, placing tiles in such a way that covers his palace locations in advance and getting the right gear and stats to deal with a particularly strong enemy. Once you know the gimmick to deal with the palace, you just need to make sure to challenge him when you have enough gear, so it isn't too hard after the first time, but I think he's a great introductory boss. Sadly, the rest of the game's bosses don't do anything like this. They all have gimmicks that only affect the combat, where the player doesn't actually do anything, so all you can do is hope you have the right stats and traits to be able to win. Even Omega, the game's final boss, is less interesting of a boss than the Lich. The main difficulty of beating his stage is that you have to fight all 3 other bosses first, and the Lich in particular made me wipe quite a lot, who, by the way, got an upgraded gimmick and his tile spread even further, which I thought was a really cool touch. Omega's in-combat gimmick is to randomly disable a stat and item of yours every 3 attacks, which just makes the fight super random because you could disable something really trivial like a 2% counter rate, or a primary stat you need to function, like max skeletons. I wish that all the bosses had some kind of different interaction with the tile system similar to Lich, some gimmick you had to build up to and prepare for during the entire run outside of the usual gearing up. This would make the final gauntlet even more challenging and interesting, since you have to manage all 4 bosses' map gimmicks in a row while gearing up for some really tough fights throughout. Or maybe the bosses could mess with you during the tile placement / looping phase to shake up the gameplay even more. I feel like they just needed something to differentiate themselves gameplay-wise. While I was playing, I would place the same tiles and go for the same gear and traits no matter which boss I was facing at the end, aside from the Lich. You might be surprised I didn't really mention long-term progression much until now. This is a roguelike after all, and so it does have a mechanic to give you long-term ways to increase your strength in runs. As you place tiles, beat monsters, and trigger tile combos, you'll get resources that can be used to make buildings in your base camp. This is how you unlock everything from minor upgrades to the hero's stats and healing ability, to new cards to use in runs, to the other classes he can have, to major mechanics including the trait system and artifacts, which is the other form of progression, which we will get to later. Now this is all fine, you get resources on your runs, you use them to unlock stuff and make future runs easier. The problem is that when you're in a run, you don't get to keep all the resources you earned unless you flee at the campsite early or beat the boss. If you die, you only get 30% of what you collected. This works really well with the game's major design theme of gauging risk and reward. Just like you can try to push your luck by placing too many enemy spawning tiles, you can also push your luck and try to go for one more loop or even try to beat the boss instead of taking the safe route and returning to camp with all your loot to build up and try again later with better stuff. My problem with this system is that losing most of your stuff sucks and is really frustrating. The reduced items you get to take back after losing to a boss will rarely be enough to make anything, so you don't even get anything that could help you in a future attempt. This meant I had to resort to going on runs just for grinding. Even attempting the boss can mean a ton of lost time, so I just had to sit on the edge of spawning it for as long as I dared, or until I hit the resource cap. Oh yeah, there's a resource cap. If you gather a certain amount of a resource during a run, you can't get any more, it's just wasted. This feels really bad. It's already hard enough to get to the cap in the first place, but it then disincentivizes you from continuing your grinding for some reason. I think it's because if you get an uncapped amount of easy-to-get resources, you can use the system later in the game called alchemy to turn them into the harder-to-get resources. But I think I would much prefer it if alchemy was changed or if these resources were excluded from it. This still wasn't my least favorite part of progression though. While it was annoying to lose stuff, the buildings you unlocked were usually very helpful and impactful, and meaningfully changed how you play the game. My real problem is the other form of progression I mentioned, artifacts. When you build the supply depot, you start finding random stuff in the middle of runs. Mirrors, cabinets, platters, garlic, stuff like that. If you bring them home with you, you can put them into slots in your camp to gain passive buffs on your run. You have a fixed amount of slots, but you can get more by building and upgrading buildings. The problem is that most of the artifacts you get are pretty much trash, and the few that are good are borderline necessary to beat the game. Sound familiar? After I unlocked everything and was trying to clear the final stage, I was having quite a bit of trouble getting up to the final boss, let alone fighting the man himself. I eventually turned to the community for tips and strategies, and one common one was to create mud huts and grind certain artifacts. Mud huts are cheap buildings for your camp that give you an artifact slot. They don't do anything, they just exist to be spammed so you can get more passive bonuses. Grinding the resources for those was one thing, but then there's the artifacts, or more specifically, the artifacts I wanted. The artifacts you get on a run are totally random, and you only get like 5 or 6 on a run that's decently long. The other way to get them is through crafting, which can give you random artifacts in a certain category, but takes the same materials as mud huts and other buildings. You can disassemble artifacts to get some materials back, but you'll eventually run out and be forced to go back to grind more resources. So, you need resources for the actually interesting buildings and unlocks. You need resources for the mud huts to hold your artifacts. You need resources for the artifacts themselves. And to grind those resources, you have to engage with the repetitive tile placing, gear comparison, and trait selection. And God forbid you die on a run, or you'll have wasted all of that time and need to grind more. And once you've gotten what feels like enough artifacts, you go back and place the same tiles and choose the same gear and traits, but this time you try to beat the boss instead of trying to leave with your resources. I don't think Loop Hero is a bad game by any means. It's very easy to boot up and start playing, and when a run ended and I unlocked something new and interesting, I immediately wanted to jump back in and test it out. I think it did a great job of slowly introducing new mechanics, where the player has to unlock all of them on their own. Even massive ones like traits and artifacts, which I think are core to the game, are not that early in the unlock tree. The sense of discovery it gives you is great, and the premise of combining idle game gameplay and rewards with a roguelike structure sounds like a solid game. The problem is that those idle inspirations are a double-edged sword. Idle games are all about grinding and waiting, but you can ignore the game and let it run for a while doing something else. Loop Hero demands constant attention to place tiles and swap gear, but isn't engaging enough to make that grind fun. You also don't really feel a difference between builds. You look at stats and place tiles no matter what class you are or what tiles you bring. All enemies blur together since you don't control combat, even bosses. It's all about numbers and whether the hero has enough damage and HP to deal with them. I'll admit, I may have partially ruined the game for myself partway through by looking up guides for beating bosses instead of experimenting. But experimentation didn't feel worth it. Trying new builds risked wasting resources, and the game punished failure harshly. So I had to choose between grinding and experimenting with little payoff, or having less fun reusing the same strategies to beat the game in a more reasonable amount of time. I chose the latter. If you have a higher tolerance for grinding or find the core loop more engaging than I did, that's fair. I'm glad you enjoyed it. For me, though, Loop Hero asks for more grind than I'm willing to give. It's charming, stylish, and very clever, but in the end, it trapped me in the same loop as the hero, repeating the same actions until the joy of discovery was gone.